Hi folks, and welcome back to the garage. In this video we're going to touch upon octane one more time in a little more detail, volatility, and then we're going to discuss ethanol, mixes of E10 and E85, and methanol. So where we left off in another video, moving up in the world here, I'm getting high tech. I've got a timer set down here so I don't have to walk behind the camera anymore and see when it's about to time out on me. Anyways, in a different video we talked about octane just a little bit, and we learned that octane is the resistance of a fuel to detonating. So it's resistance to detonation. And we mentioned that detonation is that uncontrolled form of combustion that we try to avoid in our cylinders because it creates shock waves and it can break pistons and do engine damage, and it makes this funny sound that we call pinging. And to me it always sounded like shaking marbles in a coffee can, like a kind of a rattling noise, but they call it pinging. And so our resistance to detonation, that's comparing the gasoline to isooctane, which is considered ideal. That's our reference fuel. And I'd like to talk just a minute about how they actually determine the octane of a fuel. So there's actually a special octane test engine. So, special engine that was developed just for this purpose. It's like a laboratory type engine. They take a fuel that they want to sample, they put it into this test engine, and they run it under different conditions and different loads, and they can basically determine how resistant to detonation the fuel is, and they come up with an octane number for it. So there's two different test procedures that they can do. One of them is what they call the RON, or the research octane. And the other one is called the MON, the motor octane number. Hard to write this far down on this board. Alright, so typically in practice the RON number is going to come out higher and the MON number is going to come out lower for the same fuel. So if you test the same fuel in the different conditions that they do for the RON test and the MON test, this one's going to come out lower. This one's going to come out higher. And for that reason, the two numbers really, rather than express them both, for that reason, they came up with what's known as an anti-knock index, or an AKI. So the AKI is simply the average of these two. And if you've ever gone to the gas station and you've looked at the pump and you look at the little yellow sticker that says the octane, little yellow sticker, it's got like a black border on it. If you look in the fine print down below, it'll say R plus M2. So if you add the research and the motor numbers and you divide them by 2, you average them. So that's where that number comes from. So the fuel's been run in this special test engine, and they average the two numbers. I know in some other countries they go by the research number. So for an equivalent vehicle, like a vehicle that's sold here and the service manual says, or the owner's manual says 87 octane is fine, that same vehicle sold in another country might say that it requires 91 octane. It's not that there's anything different about the vehicle, it's the way that they rate the fuel. So that's all it is. It's the same fuel, it's just got a higher number because they're using the research method instead. Alright, so just wanted to cover that. So if you've ever wondered why it says R plus M2 on the octane sticker on the pump, now you know why. Another thing about gasoline that we touched upon in a previous video, but we didn't really get that far with it, is volatility. Okay, we did mention that volatility means the ability for something to vaporize. gasoline, this is an important thing because the gasoline goes in liquid, but liquid doesn't burn. So we're either injecting liquid gasoline into the intake manifold runners or straight into the cylinder, or we're mixing liquid gasoline in a carburetor with the air coming in, but that fuel needs to vaporize. So the heat of the engine needs to be able to make that vaporize. The pressure drop that happens in your intake makes this happen as well. If you've ever wondered how you can get a cold engine to start when there's no heat in there, the fuel will still vaporize because you've got a pressure drop. We've got that manifold vacuum happening inside the intake, so that helps with the vaporization. The way they measure the volatility is with something known as RVP. That's the Reed Vapor Pressure Test. And the short version, the short explanation of RVP is a sample of whatever they want to rate is put into a sealed container. It's heated to a certain temperature. I believe it's 100 degrees, but I could be wrong. And they measure the pressure that's created in that container. Now, as you can imagine, putting gasoline in a sealed container and heating it is definitely some dangerous business, so don't ever try that at home. But you've probably experienced that if you've ever filled up a gas can, and by the time you've gotten back from the gas station, when you take the cap off, it hisses. It lets some vapor out just because the fuel has come out of that nice cold tank in the ground and is now in that can in the back of your truck or in the trunk of your car. And it's warming up, so it's going to build up some pressure in that container. So the fuel companies, the distributors, modify the Reed vapor pressure or the volatility of the gasoline for different seasons. Back to that whole cold engine thing, they'll make the volatility higher in the winter months. And as you can imagine, that helps with cold startup. What you should be aware of, though, is when you start getting to the end of winter and you've got some gas left over in the can, or like me at the beginning of this whole quarantine business, I went and I filled up my gas can with fantasies of being able to go outside and ride my dirt bike and things like that. And well, I've been doing a lot of these videos and teaching, and that hasn't happened, so that can of gas is still sitting over there in the corner. I'm going to have to use it up. What happens is sometime, somewhere around now, April, May-ish, they switch over to the summer blend of the fuel, which has a lower volatility. And if you use the winter fuel in something that's like a high-performance engine, an engine with a lot of compression, or a turbocharged engine or something to that effect, you can get into pinging. You can get into detonation a little bit, and you can get some strange running problems. You can even get what's known as a vapor lock. Vapor lock is a phenomenon we've kind of gotten away from. It used to be common in cars years ago when they had carburetors. With fuel injection, it almost doesn't happen. But vapor lock is basically when the fuel turns to a vapor in the lines rather than in the engine. And the problem with that is the pumps and the fuel injectors are not designed to deliver vapor. They're designed to deliver liquid fuel. So basically, it stops the fuel from flowing in your system, and it can be a problem. The volatility that we have in regular automotive gas, by the way, is very different than the volatility they have in aviation gas. So if you've ever heard of somebody using avgas or aviation fuel that was meant for airplanes, in engines down here on the ground, they can actually have some running issues as well because their fuel is meant to be much less volatile than automotive gas because they don't want to get into a vapor lock situation up in the air where the pressure is lower. So obviously a much greater concern for airplanes than cars, because a car you can pull over to the side of the road when it stalls. An airplane, not so much. So different fuels will have different volatility, and basically I just wanted to make sure that it was covered and that you know that the RVP or Reed vapor pressure is how they come up with that volatility, and that they do kind of manipulate, they mess with this volatility at different times of the year for different seasons. So try not to use winter gas in the summer months. And if you went the other way, if you had summer gas and let's say you've got leftover fuel from the lawnmower and you're going to try to run it in the snowblower, because it's less volatile, you may find that you have a hard time starting that snowblower. So something to think about. So they do kind of mess with the volatility. You want to keep your gas fresh. You don't want to buy cans of gas and store them for long periods of time. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about two different types of alcohol that are used as fuels. So ethanol and methanol. A little bit different. They both can be a fuel, and both actually make a pretty good fuel, but they have some different pros and cons. So ethanol is grain alcohol, whereas methanol is wood alcohol. Okay, both are flammable, both are volatile, both will work as a motor fuel. Both have very different stoichiometric ratios compared to gasoline. So an engine that was meant to run on gasoline is not going to run properly on straight ethanol without some modifications. Same can be said for methanol. So they have very different ratios. I'll cover the ratios in a minute. Okay. The great thing about ethanol is that it's renewable. Actually, the great thing about both of them is they're renewable. They burn very clean. This one burns a little cooler than gasoline. This one burns very cool as well. And actually, when ethanol and methanol evaporate, when they vaporize, they consume more heat. They absorb more heat than gasoline does, so they have a cooling effect inside the engine, which is good. Methanol has a very pronounced effect. It's like 3 times that of gasoline, so it really is a very good high-performance fuel, but it's got some pretty big drawbacks. Okay. First of all, they both absorb water, and second of all, this one is really corrosive. Corrosive and poisonous. All right, so they've used ethanol mixed with gasoline for years. Years ago, they coined the term gasohol, kind of a combination of gasoline and alcohol, so gasohol. Ethanol has been known to raise the octane of gasoline, so it's an octane enhancer. It does lower the volatility a little bit. I think in a previous video I mentioned that it raises it, so if I'm not sure, but if I did, I apologize. That was an incorrect statement. So it lowers the volatility. Same thing with methanol. The volatility is a bit less. The octane rating of both of them is much higher than regular gasoline, so that's a good thing. As we learned, you almost can't have too much octane. It's always safer to go higher. The renewable aspect of both of them is kind of attractive, and the fact that they burn clean is good for the environment, so there's definitely some pros to both of them. Currently, they're using ethanol as an additive in pump gas, and they're doing so at a rate of 10%. So E10 is 10% ethanol, 90% gasoline. It is technically what we would call gasohol. And our cars seem to run fine on it. The 10% amount doesn't upset the stoichiometric ratio that much, and because all of our modern cars are fuel injected with oxygen sensors to help us fine-tune our air-fuel ratio, it's fine. It runs fine in the cars. Our sealed gas tanks and gas caps in the cars prevent it from absorbing moisture. Where it doesn't perform quite as well, and this is debatable. I've never personally had any problems with it, but in small engines and power equipment, motorcycles, things with vented gas tanks, vented fuel systems, and also things that tend to live outside where it's moist and we go through a lot of temperature fluctuations. So like out underneath your back deck or in a shed where the temperature rises and falls and there's lots of humidity at different times of the year, it tends to pull moisture in from the air. It absorbs water, which then causes the ethanol to separate out of the gasoline, which is a problem. So then the octane is lower, and you've got this watery ethanol gunk at the bottom of the gas tank. And if you've got a carburetor, that watery ethanol gunk at the bottom of the carburetor sits there and corrodes the inside of the carburetor. So it causes a lot of issues with small engines, but not so much with cars. With cars, it's fine. And you think about it, all they did is blend in 10% ethanol into our gasoline, and they basically reduced our gasoline consumption by 10%, just like that. So that's kind of impressive. Of course, we replaced it with a different product, but at least it's a renewable product that's easy to make and is good for the environment. So a lot of pros to ethanol. You may have heard of E85, and if you can extrapolate here, if E10 is 10% ethanol, E85 is 85% ethanol. So this is available in some locations. If you go online, you can find a gas station that'll sell it. There is one around here. I looked up. There's one about 20 minutes from here. I've never actually purchased any. I've never used it for anything. But what it's good for is reducing the amount of gasoline we use, and we run it in what's known as a flex fuel vehicle. So a lot of your cars come from the factory as what they call a flex fuel vehicle, or FFV. And basically, the only thing that makes a flex fuel vehicle special is the fact that the PCM has been tuned to be able to recognize the very different stoichiometric ratio that ethanol needs. It can pick this up with the oxygen sensors, and it'll adjust. And it adjusts on the fly, and you don't have to fill the tank from empty with E85 and then run the E85 down to empty and then fill with gasoline. Any blend will work. So if you've got a half a tank of gasoline and then you fill up with E85, you really have something more like E45 in the tank, that's fine. The car will adjust. So if you've ever seen the little symbol on a car that says it's a flex fuel vehicle, or if you've ever looked at the gas cap and seen that it says E85, that's what that's all about. So not every car can accept it, and again, it's the tuning. It's how the engineers tuned the PCM to be able to respond to the differing air-fuel ratios. So it shows a lot of promise where you can get it. People do tend to like it. There is a drawback. The drawback is that you use a heck of a lot more of it because ethanol releases less heat when it burns. It releases less BTUs, or British thermal units, when it burns than gasoline, which means you need more of it. So there's another drawback of it. So your fuel mileage is way worse. You're going to burn an awful lot more of it. So I had to look it up because I wasn't positive what it was. The stoichiometric ratios, like I said, were a little bit different. Straight ethanol, or E100, has an air-fuel ratio of about 9 to 1, as opposed to our 14.7 to 1 for gasoline. E85 is 9.75 to 1, and your regular pump grade E10 is about 14.04 to 1. So we talk about 14.7 to 1, that's the number we're all taught when we're learning about stoichiometric fuel ratios, and so that's, and for those of you that aren't familiar, if we haven't discussed it prior, that's how many parts of air to 1 part of fuel by mass. So that's the air-fuel ratio that your engine wants to run at. So ethanol has definitely a worse air-fuel ratio as far as fuel consumption is going to be concerned, but we make up for it in other ways, so it's kind of a good thing. That being said, little sidebar over here, methanol has an air-fuel ratio of about 6.45 to 1. So that's you'd be burning more than double the amount of methanol than a normal engine would be if it was fueled by gasoline. And also your fuel system is going to have to be designed to be able to deliver more than double the amount of fuel. So just something to keep in mind. The air-fuel ratios are very different about these two products. So the engine management system has to be capable of handling it. If you've got a carburetor and you try to pour in straight ethanol or E85, the engine's not going to run without modifications. The carb is going to have to be rejetted or adjusted. And same can be said for methanol. They actually sell special methanol carburetors for drag racing and things like that. The internal passageways are actually bigger. They have to be. A regular gasoline carburetor actually can't deliver, or usually can't deliver, the correct amount of liquid methanol to get the engine to run properly. So requires some modifications to run. And again, like I mentioned before, with the methanol, it's highly corrosive. You can't leave that in the fuel system for long periods because it will cause corrosion. So not a very practical motor fuel for a daily driver, but very good motor fuel for a high performance application and something that you're not going to run all the time. Something that when you're done using it, you're going to drain the fuel system out and it's going to sit until the next time you use it. So racing equipment basically. And I suppose one last interesting thing about methanol before we end this video, the neat thing about it, when it burns, it has no color to the flame. It's got an invisible flame. So if you've ever seen like a crash on a race course, and you can see like the heat distortion coming up, so you know there's a fire, but you can't actually see any flames. So it's kind of dangerous. So dangerous product. But again, a lot of benefits. So anyways, I think that about wraps up the things I wanted to talk to you about today. We talked about our summer versus winter gas, how they modify the volatility and how they measure the volatility. We talked about how they come up with the octane number on the pump, the average of RON and MON. We talked about ethanol and methanol, just a quick overview of each as a fuel. So both of them you need to use more of than gasoline. So your fuel economy is going to be worse, but both of them are renewable. Both of them burn very cleanly. And we talked about our ethanol blends. So the two that we pretty much see all the time. E10, we almost don't even talk about it, and because it's just regular pump gas at this point. And E85. So if you find one of those E85 gas stations around here in your travels, let me know. You can leave it in the comments. And if you have any questions, you can leave them in the comments, and I'll be happy to answer them. So hope you enjoyed this video, and have a good night, everyone.